The Buried Emperor. The smell of dry earth, the sound of a shovel hitting something that wasn't stone. A farmer named Yang Zhifa pulled back, wiped his face, and looked down into the hole he'd been digging. It was March of 1974. A drought had come to the fields outside the city of Xi'an, in the dust-colored heart of central China. Yang and his 5 brothers, along with their neighbor Wang Puji, were digging a well. They needed water. What they found instead was a face. Not a stone face, not a carving, a life-sized human head made of red clay staring up at them from the dark of the pit. Yang did not know it yet, but his shovel had just struck the doorway of the most extraordinary tomb in human history. Beneath the field where he stood, an army of more than 8,000 men in armor was waiting in formation. They had been waiting for 2,200 years, and they had been waiting for one man. Now, before we go further, I want you to understand something. The version of Chinese history most of us were taught in the West is wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. We were told about a serene, walled-off civilization, a nation that drifted along peacefully for thousands of years, occasionally producing silk and porcelain and quiet philosophy. A culture that knew its place. That was the picture. It is a comforting picture. It is also a fairy tale. The truth is harder and stranger and far more interesting. The civilization we now call China was not born in peace. It was hammered into existence on an anvil of fire and blood by a single, ferocious mind. And the man who held that hammer is the man whose clay army Yang Zhifa stumbled upon in the spring of 1974. His name was Ying Zheng. The world remembers him as Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. He was born in the year 259 before the Common Era in the city of Handan, the capital of a state called Zhao. His father was a hostage there. His mother had been a concubine of a wealthy merchant. By every measure of his early life, he should have died young and forgotten in someone else's palace. Instead, at the age of 13, he ascended the throne of Qin, the most ruthless of the warring kingdoms that fought across the lands now called China. By the time he was 22, he ruled it absolutely. By the time he was 38, he ruled all of it. But to understand what he did, you have to first understand what he inherited. There was no China yet. That word, that idea, did not exist. What existed was a vast quilt of rival kingdoms, 7 of them, locked in a war that had been grinding on for over 2 centuries. Historians call it the Warring States period. The phrase sounds academic. The reality was apocalyptic. Picture this: a continent the size of Western Europe divided into 7 separate countries, each with its own king, its own currency, its own written script, its own weights and measures. The axles of carts in one kingdom would not fit the ruts of the roads in the next. A merchant who traveled from the state of Yan to the state of Chu would need a translator, a money changer, and the protection of armed men, because there was a real chance he would not survive the journey. This was the world Ying Zheng was born into. And these were not gentle agrarian peoples drifting toward unity. They were warrior states with iron weapons and crossbows, with armies measured in the hundreds of thousands. Consider one battle, just one. In the year 260 before the Common Era, the year Ying Zheng was a child of 1, the kingdom of Qin met the kingdom of Zhao at a place called Changping. The battle lasted 2 years. According to the historian Sima Qian, who set down these events in his Records of the Grand Historian a century later, the Qin general Bai Qi surrounded a Zhao army of 400,000 men. He starved them. He waited. And when they surrendered, he buried them alive. All of them, except for 240 of the youngest, whom he sent home to spread the terror. Now, modern historians debate the exact figures, The numbers may be exaggerated, the methods of execution may not have been precisely as described, but the underlying truth is undeniable. Hundreds of thousands of human beings were destroyed in a single campaign. The earth around Changping still occasionally surrenders the bones of the men who fell there. This was the world that produced the first emperor. Not a graceful, philosophical civilization, a continent at war with itself. A continent that had been bleeding for 10 generations. And here is where the story turns. Because in the year 230 before the Common Era, when Yin Zheng was 29 years old, he stopped waiting. He launched the war that would end all wars. State by state, year by year, his armies rolled forward. Han fell first, then Zhao, then Wei, then Chu, then Yan, until in the year 221 before the Common Era, the last free kingdom, Qi, surrendered without a fight, and for the first time in recorded history, all of these lands answered to a single throne. He was 38 years old, and he did something no Chinese ruler had ever done before. He invented a new title for himself. He would not be a king. The word was too small. He took the names of the legendary sage rulers of antiquity and welded them together into something terrifying and new. Huangdi, sovereign emperor. Qin Shi Huang, the first sovereign emperor of Qin. He declared that his dynasty would endure for 10,000 generations. He was, in his own mind, the beginning of a line that would never end. He was wrong about that. His dynasty would last 15 years. But here is what I find most remarkable. The shape of the country he forged in those 15 years, the bureaucratic skeleton, the centralized administration, the very idea of a unified Chinese state, that shape would last not for 10,000 generations, but for over 2,000 years. From Qin Shi Huang in 221 before the Common Era, to the fall of the last emperor in the year 1912. The mold he poured held for over 2 millennia. That is the part the textbooks rarely capture. We talk about Rome, and we mourn what was lost when it fell. China was not allowed to fall. It was held together again and again across centuries by an institutional template that one man imposed in a few violent years. And he is still down there, in the earth outside Xi'an, beneath a hill 76 meters high, sealed inside a tomb complex that covers 56 square kilometers. Sima Qian tells us 700,000 laborers worked on it. He tells us crossbows were rigged to fire automatically at intruders. He tells us mercury was poured into channels carved to mirror the rivers of his empire, the Yangtze, the Yellow River, the seas, all set to flow forever. For centuries we thought this was poetry, the wild imagination of an ancient writer trying to make a tyrant sound divine. Then, in the 1980s, Chinese scientists began testing the soil above the tomb mound. They found mercury concentrations far higher than anywhere else in the region. The distribution of that mercury, when mapped against the geography of his empire, traces the paths of his rivers and his seas. Sima Qian was not exaggerating. The first emperor sleeps beneath a poisoned map of the world he built. Less than 1% of the complex has ever been excavated. The main burial chamber, where Yin Zheng's body is presumed to lie, has not been opened. It may not be opened in our lifetimes. So here is the question I want you to sit with. Yang Jifa, that farmer with the shovel, broke through into a single corner of a buried world we still do not understand. 8,000 soldiers standing in silence, facing east. East toward the kingdoms their emperor once destroyed. What were they protecting him from? Death? Memory? Judgment? Or were they waiting for him to wake up and finish what he started? 2,000 years on, that question feels less rhetorical than it should. Because the empire he forged is still here, larger now, stronger. and the mind that built it has never quite stopped watching the eastern horizon. The philosophy that burned the world. What if I told you that the most powerful idea in human history is not freedom or faith or love? What if the most powerful idea is fear, dressed up in the clothing of order? There was once a kingdom in the western corner of ancient China. It was poor, it was rough. The other kingdoms looked down on it as a backwater of half-civilized people who lived too close to the barbarians of the steppe. For centuries, this kingdom had been weak, and then, in the span of a single human lifetime, it became the most terrifying military machine the ancient world had ever seen. It did not happen because of a great general. It did not happen because of new weapons or sudden gold or a charismatic king. It happened because of a book, or rather, a philosophy. A philosophy so cold, so clear-eyed about human nature, so willing to discard everything sentimental about the human heart, that when it was finally turned into law, it consumed the world that gave birth to it. The kingdom was Qin. The philosophy was called Legalism. To understand it, you have to first understand what came before. In the centuries leading up to all this, Chinese thought had been dominated by the gentle voice of an old teacher named Kongzi. The West knows him as Confucius. He had lived from around 551 to 479 before the Common Era, and he taught that human beings were essentially good. He believed that society could be healed by ritual, by family loyalty, by the moral example of virtuous rulers. He believed that if a king behaved well, his people would imitate him, and the world would right itself. It is a beautiful philosophy. It is also, by certain ruthless measures, a useless one. Because while Confucius was teaching benevolence, the 7 warring kingdoms were ripping each other apart with armies of 500,000 men. Into that chaos walked a man named Shang. He was born around the year 390 before the Common Era, the son of a concubine in a tiny state called Wei. He was an outsider, he was ambitious, and he had concluded, after watching his world burn, that Confucius was wrong about everything. Human beings, Shang believed, were not good. They were selfish, lazy, and would do whatever they could get away with. The only thing that produced order was law, strict law, public law, law that applied equally to peasant and prince, with punishments so severe that no rational person would ever break them. In the year 359 before the Common Era, Shang found a patron in Duke Xiao of the Kingdom of Qin. And for the next 20 years, he set about rebuilding that backward state from the bones outward. What he did was, by the standards of his time, unthinkable. He abolished the hereditary nobility. He told the aristocracy of Qin, families that had held power for generations, that their birth meant nothing. From now on, rank would be earned only through agricultural production or success on the battlefield. A peasant who killed 2 enemies in war could rise higher than a noble who had inherited his title. Conversely, a noble who failed in battle could be reduced to a slave. He divided every household in Qin into mutual surveillance groups of 5 and 10 families. If one member of your group committed a crime and you did not report it, your entire group would be punished alongside the criminal. Children turned in parents, neighbors turned in neighbors. The state had eyes in every village. He standardized everything: the taxes, the land, the weights, the measures, the military ranks. He privatized farmland and rewarded those who exceeded their harvest quotas. He enslaved those who fell short. And here is what struck the other kingdoms as most shocking. He applied the law even to the heir to the throne. When the crown prince violated one of his statutes, Shang could not legally punish the prince himself, but he punished the prince's tutors instead, mutilating their faces. The message was clear. No one was above the law, not even the future king. The reforms worked. Within a generation, Qin had become a war machine of terrifying efficiency. Its armies fought with iron discipline, its bureaucracy taxed and conscripted with cold precision. Its peasants, motivated by the prospect of advancement through bloodshed, marched eagerly to the front. Shang himself died badly. After his patron Duke Xiao passed away, his enemies in the nobility, the men he had stripped of power, came for him. He was executed by being torn apart between chariots in the year 338 before the Common Era. His own laws, when applied to him, offered no mercy. But the philosophy outlived the man, and then, a century after Shang Yang's death, it found its most dangerous interpreter. A prince of the small kingdom of Han, born around 280 before the Common Era, named Han Feizi. Han Feizi took everything Shang Yang had built and pushed it further. He synthesized 3 streams of thought into a single doctrine. From Shang Yang, he took the rule of impersonal law. From a thinker named Shen Buhai, he took the techniques by which a ruler could manipulate his ministers and never be deceived. From Shen Dao, he took the principle that the ruler's authority must be absolute, like gravity, beyond question. Together, these became the philosophical Bible of total state power. And Han Feizi's writings reached the eyes of a young king named Ying Zheng, the king of Qin, the man who would become the first emperor. Now, here is what I find most chilling. Ying Zheng read Han Feizi and reportedly said that if he could meet the man who wrote those words, he would die happy. He did meet him. Han Feizi was sent as an envoy to Qin, and then, through court intrigue stirred up by Han Feizi's own former classmate, a man named Li Si, Han Feizi was forced to drink poison in his cell. The philosopher who had perfected the doctrine of absolute power was killed by the doctrine of absolute power. Li Si lived, and when Ying Zheng completed his conquest of all China in 221 before the Common Era, it was Li Si who stood at his right hand as Grand Chancellor, the architect of the new empire. Together they built something the world had never seen. They divided the conquered lands into 36 commanderies, each governed by officials appointed by the throne, none of them allowed to inherit their positions. They standardized the writing script across the entire empire so that a scholar in the south could read a decree issued in the north. They standardized the currency to a single round bronze coin with a square hole in the center. They standardized the axle widths of carts. They standardized the weights and measures. They confiscated every bronze weapon in the conquered states and melted them down into 12 colossal statues, each weighing 70 tons, that stood in the imperial capital like a warning to anyone who might dream of resistance. And then, in the year 213 before the Common Era, Li Si proposed the act that would haunt his name forever. He told the emperor that the past was dangerous, that as long as scholars could read the histories of the conquered kingdoms, as long as they could quote the poetry and philosophy of the 100 schools of thought, they would forever compare the present to the past, and the present would lose. So Li Si proposed that the books be burned, all of them, except those on agriculture, medicine, and divination. Anyone who discussed the forbidden classics in public would be executed. Anyone who used the past to criticize the present would have their entire family put to death. The emperor agreed. The following year, according to Sima Qian, 460 scholars were executed. Some accounts say buried alive. Modern historians question the precise numbers and methods. The story comes to us through Han Dynasty chroniclers, written more than a century later, and they had every reason to blacken the memory of the dynasty they replaced. But the broad truth survives the scrutiny. Books were destroyed, scholars were killed. The intellectual past of Chinese civilization was deliberately attacked. Notice what was happening here. The emperor had already conquered the Seven Kingdoms. He had already disarmed them. He had already remade their laws and their script and their currency. But that was not enough. He needed to conquer their memory. This is the part that strikes me. Not the violence itself. Tyrants throughout history have killed scholars. What strikes me is the recognition behind it. The understanding that as long as people remember a different way of being, the new order is fragile. To make the new world permanent, the old world must be unmade, not just defeated, erased. Stand for a moment in the imperial capital of Xianyang in the year 212 before the Common Era. The smell of smoke, the gates of the libraries thrown open, officials carrying out armloads of bamboo scrolls, the accumulated wisdom of 500 years of philosophy, and feeding them too. The bonfires in the courtyards, a few scholars watching from the shadows, memorizing what they could before the flames took it. The fires of Qin burned for months, and when they finally went out, an empire stood that no one had ever imagined possible. A single ruler, a single law, a single script, a single memory, sanctioned and approved. The mold had been cast in fire. Whatever China would become in the centuries that followed, it would be poured into this shape, the center of the world. How does an empire end? Not in a single battle, not in a single year. It ends the way a great tree dies, invisibly, from the inside, years before anyone notices the leaves have stopped coming back. In the summer of 210 before the Common Era, somewhere on a dusty road in eastern China, an emperor was dying inside a sealed carriage. He was 49 years old. He had conquered 7 kingdoms. He had built a great wall. He had unified a script, a currency, a legal code, and the deepest assumptions of an entire civilization. And in his final months, he had become obsessed with something he could not conquer. He wanted to live forever. He had sent expeditions to find the islands of the immortals in the Eastern Sea. He had consumed elixirs prepared by court alchemists, potions thick with cinnabar, the red ore of mercury. The very metal he had ordered poured into the rivers of his future tomb was now poisoning his blood. The first emperor of China had spent his life ordering the world, and he could not order his own body to stop dying. His chief advisor, Li Si, sealed the carriage and concealed the death for weeks. Salted fish was loaded into nearby wagons to mask the smell. The dynasty Ying Zheng had declared would last 10,000 generations did not survive him by 4 years. In the year 206 before the Common Era, the Qin capital fell to a peasant rebel named Liu Bang, a former village constable, a man who could barely read. By 202, after a brutal civil war against another warlord, Liu Bang had taken the throne for himself. He chose a new name for his dynasty. He called it Han. And here is where the story breaks every Western expectation. You would think the Han would tear down what the hated Qin had built. The book burnings, the harsh laws, the surveillance networks, the legalist machinery of state. You would think the Han would restore the old kingdoms, return power to the nobility, undo the violence of unification. They did not. They kept almost all of it. They softened the laws, they eased the taxes, they rehabilitated Confucianism and made it the official ideology of the throne. But the bureaucratic skeleton, the commanderies, the standardized script, the centralized administration, the very idea of a single emperor ruling all under heaven, that they kept. They kept it because it worked, and because by then, no one could imagine ruling China any other way. This is one of the strangest sleights of hand in human history. The Qin dynasty is remembered as a tyranny. The Han dynasty is remembered as a golden age. But the Han ruled with the iron the Qin had forged. They simply painted it a softer colour and gave it a kinder name. The Han would last, in two phases interrupted by a brief usurpation, for over 400 years. From 202 before the Common Era to 220 of the Common Era. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the same span of time as the entire history of the Roman Empire, from Augustus to its split at the death of Theodosius. And during those 4 centuries, China became something the world had never seen. The Han built their capital on the Wei River, in the shadow of the old Qin power center, and they gave it a name that was a prayer: Chang'an, long-lasting peace. Construction began around 194 before the Common Era. By the height of the Western Han period, Chang'an was home to roughly 300,000 people, making it one of the 2 largest cities on Earth, alongside Imperial Rome. And then came the road. In the year 138 before the Common Era, the Han emperor known as Wu Di, the martial emperor, sent a man westward into the unknown. His name was Zhang Qian. His mission was diplomatic, almost desperate. The Han were locked in a long, grinding war against the Xiongnu nomads of the northern steppe, the same horse riders the first emperor had built his Great Wall to keep out. Wu Di had heard rumors of a people called the Yuezhi, displaced by the Xiongnu, who might become Han allies. So he sent Zhang Qian to find them. Zhang Qian rode out of Chang'an with a small expedition. Almost immediately he was captured by the Xiongnu. He was held for over 10 years. He was given a Xiongnu wife. He had a child. He waited. And then, when the moment came, he escaped, and he kept going west, toward the Yuezhi, who no longer wanted his alliance. He turned around. He was captured again. He escaped again. After 13 years, he finally returned to Chang'an. He had failed his mission.
But he had brought back something more valuable. He had brought back maps. He had brought back the names of cities and kingdoms in Central Asia, in Persia, in lands that touched the borders of the Roman world. He had walked in a lopsided arc, the eastern half of what we now call the Silk Road. Wu Di sent him out again in 119 before the Common Era. This time, the diplomacy worked. Alliances were made. Trade caravans began to move. Within a generation, Chinese silk was being worn by the wealthy of the Mediterranean. Roman senators were complaining that their wives were spending too much money on a fabric so light it seemed to be woven from cloud. None of them knew where it came from. They knew only that it came from a land in the Far East called Serica. Now, here is the part Western histories rarely dwell on. The Silk Road was not a Roman achievement. It was not a Persian achievement. It was a Han-Chinese achievement. The single greatest commercial network of the ancient world was opened by an empire most Europeans of that era had no idea existed. By the 1st century of the Common Era, the Han economy alone is estimated by some historians to have accounted for roughly 1/3 of all global wealth, and the cultural traffic flowed in both directions. Buddhism, born in India, began to drift up the Silk Road into China during the late Western Han. Within centuries, it would transform Chinese spiritual life. Persian fire worshippers, Christian missionaries, Manichaean prophets. They would eventually all find welcome in the Chinese capital. Chang'an was not isolated. It was the eastern terminal of the largest cultural crossroads humanity had ever built.
Inside that capital, something else extraordinary was happening. The Han were inventing the future. In the year 105 of the Common Era, a court eunuch named Cai Lun presented the emperor with a new substance. He had taken tree bark, hemp waste, old rags and fishing nets, beaten them into a pulp in water, pressed them into thin sheets and dried them. He called it paper. There had been earlier, cruder forms. Cai Lun perfected it. The information revolution that would transform human civilization, the technology that would eventually carry the Bible to Europe and the Quran to North Africa and Confucian classics across all of East Asia, was developed in a Chinese palace nearly 1,500 years before Gutenberg's press. 27 years later, in the year 132 of the Common Era, an astronomer named Zhang Heng presented the imperial court with another miracle. A bronze urn, taller than a man, decorated with 8 dragons facing the cardinal directions, each holding a small bronze ball in its mouth. Beneath each dragon sat a bronze frog with its mouth open to the sky. Inside the urn was a pendulum. When the earth shook, even faintly, even hundreds of kilometers away, the pendulum would swing. The mechanism would release the ball from one specific dragon's mouth, and the ball would drop with a soft chime into the frog below. By looking at which frog held the ball, the astronomers could tell which direction the earthquake had come from. The world's first seismograph. 18 centuries before any European thought to build one. The Han also produced what they called the south-pointing spoon, a magnetic compass used at first for divination rather than navigation. They made advances in metallurgy, in mathematics, in astronomy, that the West would not match for over 1,000 years. And here is what I want to leave you with. The civilization that the Western imagination so often paints as static, as backward, as merely decorative, was not. It was, for centuries, the technological and economic engine of the entire planet. The first paper, the first seismograph, the first compass, the first true global trade network. While Europe was still measuring itself against fading memories of Rome, the Han were measuring earthquakes, mapping the heavens, and weaving silk thin enough to make Roman moralists furious. The first emperor had built the cage. The Han filled it with light. And buried inside that light was a question that would echo for 2,000 years. If a single empire can hold this much, learn this much, build this much, then what happens when its center finally cracks? What happens when the pillar falls? The world would soon find out. The Phoenix in the Ashes. There is a letter written sometime around the year 1046 before the Common Era that almost no one outside of China has ever read. It was carved into the inside of a bronze ritual vessel by a noble of the newly victorious Zhou dynasty, just after they had overthrown the Shang. The Zhou were a smaller people. They had defeated a larger civilization. They needed an explanation. And the explanation they invented would last for 3,000 years. They called it the Mandate of Heaven. The idea was simple and devastating. The right to rule did not come from blood. It did not come from conquest. It came from a cosmic force called Tian, heaven itself. Heaven granted its mandate to a virtuous ruler. And heaven could revoke that mandate when the ruler became corrupt. Famines, floods, peasant revolts, foreign invasions, these were not random tragedies. They were signals. They were heaven announcing that the current dynasty had failed and that someone else, anyone else, even a peasant with a sword and an army, had now received the divine right to rule. This single idea, born to justify one military victory 3,000 years ago, became the operating system of Chinese civilization. From the Zhou in 1046 before the Common Era, all the way down to the abdication of the last emperor in the year 1912 of the Common Era. Almost 3,000 years, through every dynasty, through every civil war, through every conquest by foreign invaders, the mandate of heaven endured. And here is what I find genuinely remarkable about it. It was not just a tool of legitimation, it was also, built into the same idea, a license for revolution. If the emperor was bad enough, the people had the right, even the duty, to overthrow him. No European doctrine of divine right of kings ever contained this loophole. The mandate of heaven was a leash that ran in both directions. This is why China kept reassembling itself. Think about what that means. The Roman Empire fell once in the West, and it never came back. The territories that had been Rome shattered into Germanic kingdoms, then into medieval fiefdoms, then into modern nations that still cannot agree on a single language, a single currency, or a single border. Rome died, and Europe spent the next 1,500 years trying and failing to put it back together. China fell apart too, many times. The Han collapsed in the year 220 of the Common Era, and the country fragmented into the three kingdoms. Later came the chaos of the northern and southern dynasties, lasting nearly 200 years. Later still came the Five Dynasties period, when the country split again into rival states. Each time, by every reasonable measure, China should have ended. Each time, it should have become Europe. It never did. Each time, after a generation or a century of fragmentation, someone would emerge who claimed the mandate of heaven, who would conquer the rival states, and who would rebuild the imperial bureaucracy on the same template the first emperor had imposed in 221 before the Common Era. The same script, the same examinations, the same commanderies, the same idea that all under heaven must answer to a single throne. And here is the strangest part. Even when foreign conquerors took China, even when the empire was overrun by horsemen from the steppes, the empire did not become them, they became it. In the year 1271, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, declared himself the founder of a new Chinese dynasty. He called it the Yuan. By 1279, his Mongol armies had crushed the last of the southern Song. For the first time in history, all of China was ruled by a non-Chinese people. You would expect this to be the end of Chinese civilization. The Mongols had destroyed entire kingdoms across Asia. They had erased cities. They had terrified Europe so badly that mothers in Hungary were still using their name to frighten children 3 centuries later. In China, something very different happened. Within a generation, Kublai Khan was performing Confucian rituals at his court. He was patronizing Chinese scholars. He was administering his empire through a Chinese-style bureaucracy. By the time the Yuan dynasty fell in 1368, many of his Mongol descendants spoke Chinese as their first language and could no longer read the old Mongol script. The pattern repeated almost exactly 2.5 centuries later. In the year 1644, a different group of foreign conquerors, the Manchus, descendants of
the old Jurchen people of the northeast, swept through the gates of the Great Wall when a Ming general opened them out of desperation. The Manchus founded the Qing dynasty. They ruled China for the next 268 years, and during those centuries, despite their best efforts to maintain a separate identity, they too were absorbed. By the time their dynasty collapsed in 1912, many Manchus had taken Chinese surnames. Many spoke only Chinese. The conquering people had been quietly digested by the civilization they conquered. This is the part that no Western framework really captures. We tend to think of empires as machines that crush other cultures. China is something stranger. It is an empire that crushes its conquerors. The Sinosphere is a kind of cultural gravity well. Things fall in,
things do not climb back out. Now, modern scholars have rightly complicated this picture. The Manchus, in particular, kept more of their own identity than older histories acknowledged. The story is not as clean as the cliché of total absorption, but the pattern, in its broad outline, is real. China kept its bones even when foreign hands wore the imperial robes. So let me try to weave the threads. We began with cracking turtle shells in the courts of the Shang, 3,500 years ago, where diviners read the will of the ancestors in patterns of fire-broken bone. We watched a kingdom in the Western Edge, hardened by a cold philosophy of law, hammer 7 warring states into a single empire in the year 221 before the Common Era. We watched its first emperor build a tomb beneath a poisoned river of mercury, a man who tried to outlive death itself and lost. We watched his harsh dynasty fall in 15 years, and we watched its successor, the Han, take everything ruthless that the Qin had built and dress it in the gentler clothes of Confucian ethics. We watched Chang'an become one of the largest cities on Earth. We watched the Silk Road open like a vein, carrying Chinese silk to Rome and Persian fire worship and Indian Buddhism back the other way. We watched a bronze urn, 50 years before the birth of Christ would have been recorded in the West, predict earthquakes hundreds of kilometers away. And then we watched the cycle. Dynasties rising and falling, conquerors absorbed. The mandate of heaven changing hands again and again, while the underlying machine kept turning. Qin, Han, Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, Qing. Different names, different ruling houses, different official ideologies. But beneath them all, the same imperial template, the same bureaucratic skeleton, the same cosmic claim to all under heaven. China is not a country in the way the West understands countries. China is something older. China is a civilization that learned very early how to die without ending. So here is the question I want to leave you with. The textbooks tell us that the modern People's Republic, founded in 1949, is a new nation, a young nation, barely older than the lifetimes of people walking around today. The textbooks tell us we are dealing with a 20th century construct, a rival superpower in the language of nuclear deterrence and trade balances and semiconductor chains. But what if the textbooks are wrong? What if the leadership in Beijing today is not the head of a young nation at all, but the latest holder of the mandate of heaven? What if the bureaucracy that governs more than 1 billion people is not a communist invention, but a continuation, in red clothing, of the same imperial machinery the first emperor cast in fire 2,200 years ago? What if every 5-year plan and every grand strategic project, the new Silk Roads, the rising of artificial islands in distant seas, the slow, patient consolidation of power, is not the behavior of a young state finding its feet, but the breathing of an old empire taking its next inevitable inhale? History does not teach us who was right and who was wrong. It teaches us that civilizations survive by remembering what they are, even when they have forgotten how to say it out loud. The first emperor sleeps beneath his hill of mercury, sealed inside a tomb less than 1% excavated. The clay soldiers face east in silence. The earth holds its secrets. And somewhere above them, the empire he built, 3,500 years older than its current name, is still awake, still watching, still waiting. The black box closes for now. Until we meet again, stay
Curious.